I remember after the Lord of the Rings trilogy came out, not the books, I don't remember when the books came out, but when the movies came out, I remember that there was not a popular appetite for fantasy storytelling. That was for nerds, it was for kids, for babies, it was for comic book readers and people who play Final Fantasy on their PlayStation and Dungeons and Dragons and understand the physics of a 20-sided dice. It was for people like that. But then Lord of the Rings was just so dang good with themes that I'm not even sure people understood why they resonated with, why they loved it. Because, I mean, it's so rooted in a story that makes sense. It just resonated across the board, across the political spectrum. It was awesome. One of those movies, the third one, won Best Picture. Are you kidding me? And all of a sudden, there's this big appetite for more of that. As soon as those movies are over, give me more fantasy storytelling. That was great. And of course, then a bunch of executives come along and they're like, hey guys, I have an idea. What if we do something that's like Lord of the Rings, but dark and gritty and super adult? Then a whole bunch of those kind of shows, movies, series come out. I don't know, most of them probably didn't work super well. A couple of them worked pretty well. But what they all had in common, regardless of their goodness or badness, what they all had in common, those shows that came out inspired by the Lord of the Rings, is that they all had some kind of opening moment where they tried to shock you in the first few scenes to say, this isn't Middle Earth. This isn't your father's fantasy story. This one's gonna be dirty. And it worked. I always got the message. I always knew what to expect after that, for better or for worse. And in a way, if you have a genre that people are already familiar with, but you are going to do something very different with it, it makes sense to point that out early on. And this is a long way of saying likewise, but likewise, I think we're running into that as we get into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are a combo book, in contrast with where we've been with another very important bit of biblical Persian Bible, and that is Esther. These books do not feel the same, and you know that within two verses. Really, I mean, you know it within one verse, really. Let me see if you can catch it. I know that I read the first verse of Ezra the other day. I'm going to do it again, okay? See if you can tell why Ezra doesn't feel like Esther right off the bat. Here's the first verse, Ezra 1. There you go. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. Did you catch it? Why doesn't it feel like Esther? Yeah, nice job. You're good at this. I don't know. If you didn't get it, just pretend like you got it and just take the compliment and the high five and all of that, right? It mentions God twice in the first verse. That's 2 more times than God got mentioned in all of Esther. So what we know right off the bat is that here the author of this book is giving clear, overt, and obvious credit to God. God is going to be mentioned. God is going to be on the screen. God is going to be credited as the overseer and hands-on providential director of all of these events that we're going to see. So that's huge. Right off the bat, we know the underlying thesis of Ezra and Nehemiah is going to be different than Esther. In Esther, God doesn't even have to be mentioned. He's so in charge and so powerful that all the blustering kings think they're running things, but they don't run things. The God who's so secure in his own skin that you don't even have to point him out, and he can still handle things when nobody even notices that he's there. That God is the God of history, and even for any reader in any century, even any millennia after this was written down in the first place, that same God is still providentially orchestrating history for his redemptive purposes, even when it might look like he's not there. It's a very powerful theme. The theme in Ezra is clearly going to be something very, very different because God is operating on screen, on camera. He's front and center. He's twice mentioned in the first verse. So that's a big difference right off the bat. Whoa, we're not in the genre anymore. This is a tweak on the genre. This isn't like Esther. The second thing is that we get this big long block quote from Cyrus about the Lord, the God of heaven. There's 2 more right off the bat. That's 4 Lord and God references already in 1.5 verses. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem and Judah, and then God, and then God, and then God, and then God, I think 4 more times, and Lord is in there too. 5 more times he's going to mention God in there. And that block quote indicates that, okay, we're doing something that's a little more record-oriented here. This isn't built the way Esther is, where within the first few verses of the book of Esther, you're like, oh, this is going to be told in the style of a great, intriguing, dynamic, dramatic story. Well, we're going to get drama in Ezra and Nehemiah as well. It's just going to be different. in terms of the way it's packaged. So all of that stuff is popping right off the bat. And then we run into the conundrum that we were talking about the other day. And that conundrum is, can these people pull themselves together enough, be unified culturally and religiously and financially and geographically and in terms of their vision, that they are willing to endure whatever they have to endure to seize the opportunity that has been put in front of them by not some fluke of history, not even Cyrus the Great, but that has been put in front of them by God himself, who has moved the hearts of kings and moved pieces around on the battlefield to bring things to this moment with this guy, Cyrus, who he specifically said by name would end up being king and who God specifically said would do this exact thing. There we are. Can these people, can the Jewish exiles respond to this opportunity and go and do something that they haven't been able to really meaningfully pull off for half a millennium? What were you doing half a millennium ago, right? I mean, have you gone and even looked at English half a millennium ago? You can barely read it. If you go 600 years back, you can't read the English. You'll catch a few words here and there, but you would be functionally illiterate and unable to communicate with anyone if you went back 600 years in time and went to England 700, 800 years. It just keeps getting harder and harder the further back you go. That's how long we're talking about here, since they had demonstrated the kind of cultural unity that produces great things like the huge legendary cathedrals that you see when you go and poke around in the big grand old cities of Europe. So the question that's in front of us then is, who's going to respond? And the answer is, not very many people are going to respond. Just north of 40,000 people end up saying yes, but they look awesome, right? Because this is a tiny minority of people who get it, who see the opportunity, and apparently that's enough. Just north of 40,000 out of however many exponentially more people there were, just that many volunteer. But it conjures to mind for me those kind of scenes that you get in war movies. And I guess we can go back to the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, the council they have there at Rivendell. See, I would have sounded like a huge nerd just 20 years ago before those movies came out. You would have made fun of me. You would have used that voice that you use for people who LARP. And instead, you're like, oh yeah, the council at Rivendell. I totally remember. I remember I could name every single person who was there and 5 memes that were born out of that. Yeah, the council of Rivendell. Remember when everybody starts stepping up and they're like, you got my axe and you got my sword and you got my bow and I will take the ring. In Glory, one of my favorite movies ever that I talk about all the time, you got the scene where the most unlikely of heroes step forward and they're like, we'll lead the charge on Fort Wagner. It's one of those scenes where you try to pretend like you're not crying because you want your kids to still respect you. So you do the kind of cry where you're like, but they know what that means. I don't know if it hurts their respect level or not, but you just can't keep it in when somebody volunteers to be the tip of the spear, to go into the unknown, to do the super difficult thing that only a small minority of people need to have the courage to do. But if they do, this is going to go to plan. And again, here, my friend, is the difference between what we're getting tonally in Ezra, what we're getting in terms of the parameters of the story versus what we got in Esther. Here in Ezra and Nehemiah, we know that God is behind all of it. We know that God is himself setting the table and exhorting his own people to do this. But we also know, because of the way God is presented here, that from the get-go, he knew it was only going to be a small minority of people who would have the vision for this and who would go and do it. And what we discover as we get into chapter 2 of the book of Ezra, which we're not going to go over with in great care. I mean, we'll spend less than one day on it. But what we discover is that it was worth commemorating who crossed that line and responded to the call, who was able to read the situation and say, yeah, I'll go. Send me. I'm in. I've been actually looking forward to this. This was predicted. This was promised. I bet a bunch of the people in this list who crossed that line, I bet a whole bunch of them had verses from Daniel rattling around in their brain about promises, what God was going to put back together in the timeline he was going to do it in. I bet a bunch of the people who crossed this line had stuff from Jeremiah rattling around in their brain, both the hope and promise that's in there and all the sadness and lamentation that's in the writing of Jeremiah, a chance to undo that sorrow and brokenness and heartache. I bet a whole bunch of them even had the gloating words of the kings who defeated the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom about how they came along and they crushed these petty people and their weak God. I bet that was still rattling around in their heads the same way it rattled around in the head of David. The Goliath was out here mocking the one true God. All of that stuff swirls together for these people to go and do something that on paper doesn't make a ton of sense. They're going to make a cross-country trip. I actually measured this out very carefully and lined it up from basically east central Kansas, just a little south and west of Kansas City, all the way to coal mining country of West Virginia. They're going to do that overland with all of their stuff, and they're going to have to move quickly just in case the breezes of political opinion or whatever might suddenly blow the other way. They're going to have to pull that together. They're going to have to leave more than three generations of putting down roots in Susa, in Persia, and they got to go do this right now. No time to think. The commander is calling. The line has been drawn in the sand. Who will carry this flag? Who will be the tip of the spear? Who will lead the charge? And these 40,000+ people are like, yeah, we see what this is. We know what this moment is. And chapter 2 of Ezra commemorates it. It gives credit to the households and the descendants so that the names of the people who saw it would be commemorated and honored. And there are a few of these names. Well, all of them are worthy of honor. I think this is an amazing moment in history. You can maybe hear a little bit of the emotion in my voice. But there are a few other names here that really pop for some big picture reasons that have to do with the whole big story of the Old Testament, as well as the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. So in the same way that every single fantasy show that came out after The Lord of the Rings went out of their way in the opening chapter to say, this is different, the ground rules are different, expect a different tone here. So right off the bat, as we get into Ezra and Nehemiah, we see that it's setting a very different tone with very different expectations for how the story will be treated and how it will unfold than what we see in the companion book to these two, which is Esther. More on how all of this plays out next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.